Hi, welcome to another podcast from Ian Wallace, the Messed Up Counsellor. Today's podcast is about painting pictures and losing the content. And if you ever get into a situation where you become bored with somebody's conversation, then usually it's because of this. So hopefully today we're going to talk about that and get people to understand how best to be heard and listened to. If you feel that this would be helpful to share, then please do so, as you never know whether it will be helpful for somebody else. So when we talk, when we explore, when we have a conversation, we're kind of going through a process of, dependent on who it is we're talking to, and depends how close that relationship is, and how comfortable that relationship is, will depend on how we have that conversation. So, if, for example, you're talking to somebody that you might be nervous about talking to, say it was a boss or somebody in a power position, then you might change how you have that conversation, the words you use, the way you use the words, the kind of process in communicating. Because of that nervousness, you may kind of talk, really not necessarily about anything as a content, but you might, what I call, paint a picture. So what I mean by that is that we put an awful lot of words in to describe or sort to kind of talk about what we're talking about. And we put all micro words in about colours, size, shapes, where they are, what they are, how they are. And we kind of create a massive dialogue because of our nervousness and anxiety, our insecurity. But by the time we get to the actual piece of communication that we're trying to share, the content, if you like, then the other person really is turned off. They're no longer listening because their content hasn't been got to, hasn't been understood, hasn't been given the importance maybe it needs to have. So when we're going through that process of communication, when we're painting the pictures and losing the content, it's usually because we're unsure about the person we're having that conversation with. We have some kind of insecurity, some kind of distancing or kind of blocking process. When I go through the counselling room, I see this in couple dialogue and individual dialogue, to be honest. Then I bring reference to it, because if they're doing that with me, and we're supposed to have a very close, trusting relationship, very bonded relationship, then the chances are with other people outside of the room, they're doing it even more. And that might stop them getting their voice heard, thinking they're being listened to. And we all like to be heard and listened to. But if we use that process of painting the pictures, very, very minute detail, then you'll lose the message, the content that you're trying to give. And that's the important thing. The picture is only there to kind of reinforce the content. But by giving too much of the picture, you lose the content. And you'll see that when you look at art, because the content will be in the picture, but the picture has lots and lots of different colours that can confuse you, that can distract you, that can take you away from the content. And that's why art can be such an exploration process for everybody, because we all look at it differently. We all see different aspects of it. So when we're doing that in a conversation, then by the time we get to the content, a lot of time may have elapsed. In my world, in the counselling world, I try to bring immediacy to that. I try to bring that into the room, not as a way of kind of telling the other person off, complaining, criticising, but as a I'm wondering what, I'm wondering if. Have you ever thought? In a way of kind of giving them an understanding that these processes of communication are not, generally speaking, helpful when they're trying to get a message across. Most people don't realise that. Most people don't see that that's what's going on. Most people don't even become aware of it unless somebody says something, which is why I think as a counsellor it's helpful for me to do so. Now, in some forms of counselling, that would be not as helpful, obviously, because all counselling models are different, all ways of working are different. But in my world, that immediacy of bringing awareness to that, bringing that into the process, is helpful for the person I'm working with, as I've said. If we become aware of that, then we can bring less picture, which will enable more content. So if we start with the content, what I'm trying to say is, the aspect of importance is, that then will help the other person that you're engaging with in that conversation to be aware that it's important to you, to be aware that it is something that needs to be listened to, something that isn't about the holiday you had, or in fact what you're trying to do is tell them that you hurt yourself. So that process of painting the picture isn't necessarily helpful. We do that without realising it, as I've said. So if you feel that you're in some kind of connection with another person and you aren't feeling as though you're being heard or listened to, then think about this, because it's likely that you're painting the picture and losing the content. And the other person is kind of going off on some other thought process in their head, because maybe you've said that, that was a nice colour in your picture of sky. And their head might go, oh, yes, it is actually. I think I need some curtains or some bedding or some covers or some throws in that. And their head's going off on that thinking process. And their ears have disengaged. They're not concentrating on what you're telling them, because some aspect of what you've said has become interesting, but not because it's part of your content, because it's something that they've gone off in a process of thought, a fantasy process, an imaginational process. So when we do that, when you find that you're not being listened to, just take a note of how you're delivering that conversation. And you could, if you felt secure enough, say to the person, I'm really sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. This is actually what I was trying to tell you. And bring it back to the content. And I suppose that's what we do as counsellors sometimes in our work. We make what people are talking about much more succinct, much more condensed. So what you're really talking about is X, Y, Z. Well, yeah. And you might say to, if there's a couple or a family member in this process of counselling, say, well, is that what you heard, X, Y, Z? No, I didn't hear X, Y, Z. What I heard was this, A, B, C. And that sometimes can help both people to understand each other more, obviously, but it also helps them to unite, to join together, to bring a closer connection, because the other person who is hearing this process can then think, well, okay, so why are you feeling insecure? What are you feeling about this process that we're talking about? That might help us to become much more clear, much more able to share, feel connected, obviously, emotionally, verbally. And it might help us to have less conversation, but more content. And that process of exploration, that process of insecurity, feeling anxious, feeling nervous, is in all of us. Some of the best speakers on the planet that I've worked with over the last 20 years, in their relationships, they don't communicate effectively. Now, that might sound weird, that somebody whose business, whose world is about communicating on the stage or in front of the camera, can have that problem. But when we're working in a relationship that's a close, loving, connected relationship, we're more insecure. And the reason for that is usually because we're worried, scared, concerned that they might leave us. They may not be there next week, next month, next year. So the conversation will change. So even though they're massively good communicators in the outside world, in their career, or whatever it is they're doing, with their relationship partners, in families, friends, closer relationships, then that vulnerability, that insecurity will occur with all of us usually, to a lesser or greater degree, obviously. But as relationships come under strain, and there's more possibility of somebody leaving, then that relationship process, the painting the pictures and losing the content, becomes more significant. And you'll see that time and time again. It's not an uncommon process. It's part of all of us. Sometimes I lose track of what I'm talking to you about. And sometimes I can go off on a tangent. Hopefully, I don't lose the content. That would be extremely silly, given that's what I'm talking about. But I'm sure sometimes I do. I'm sure sometimes you turn off, even if you're watching one of these podcasts or listening to it. And that process means that I am now painting pictures and losing content. So we all do it. And that process of understanding it, becoming aware of it, helps us to become more connected, become more engaged with the person or persons we're working with. Sometimes those detours can be quite funny, quite hilarious sometimes. But if the point I'm trying to put across is important to me, then that is something I need to be aware of. Because at the end of the day, that's the reason for the communication. In the olden days, we used to use the scenario and situation of people on two ships trying to communicate with each other. And the communication would be longer than being face to face, because one person on one ship would say X, Y, Z, and then the other person on the other ship would repeat what they'd heard. So each person understood exactly what it was that was being said. Now that's a longer process of communication because it's going backwards and forwards, But actually it's a more effective one because then both people know what each other is saying. The process of the message is usually less words and more direct information. And if something's important, then we should use less words and become more engaging, more connected. How many times have somebody said to you, I didn't hear what you said, but you're talking from a different room. You're talking when they're engaged in something that their mind's focused on. If something's important, then you need to give it space and time. You need to make an appointment. Need to make us say, can do this at 8 o'clock tonight when we're both less busy, or the kids have been put to bed, or we're able to engage together instead of being on a telephone or via text. Those processes would help us to understand each other more. But unfortunately, life is not like that. Sometimes we are trying to have those conversations that's important over getting the kids ready to school, getting meal cooked, going out and doing something with friends or connections. So when we've got something important to say, then we need to give it space and time to make it happen. We need to be more concise. We need to be more engaged, more listening, more being heard. And our process in counselling is usually when we're looking at communication, and communication is effective in everything we do, whether it's verbal or not. So we look at slowing that conversation down. We look at engaging those two people in a more concise way. We're kind of like an interpreter sometimes. We kind of interpret what's been said and we check that out, whether that's been received by the other person. And in the process of communication, then that is always more helpful. We're not saying we're going to get it right every time. My interpretation of what's been said is sometimes wrong, obviously. But at least we're having a conversation about the content. And people have said to me, no, actually, that's not what I meant. I'll say, okay, that's great, no problem. What is it that you did mean? Because I lost you. And that process can help people understand communication a bit more and how they can make it more effective and more helpful. And that will engage with another person or parties, and that will make it more heard and listened to. So if you get bored with somebody's conversation, don't just let it happen, because it's important what they're trying to say. So respectfully, bring that back to, I've lost the point of what you're trying to tell me here. Can you tell me that again? But can you tell me what you want to tell me? And if you're a person who doesn't feel heard, then engage with your conversation differently and ask the other person what it is they heard you say. Check it. See if it's okay. See if it's what you're trying to tell them. Be surprised how many times that won't be the same. And if you've ever played Chinese whispers, where one person relates to another person something of information, short sentence sometimes, and by the end it gets to the 10th person, 20th person down the line, and it's completely different, that's because those processes of miscommunication work between all of us at all times. So sometimes we're not listening properly and we're not checking it out. Now, if you do the Chinese whispers thing, and when one person tells you this sentence, whatever it is you're trying to convey, and then you go back to them and say, well, that's what I heard. Was that right? Yeah, that was right. No, that wasn't. What I was trying to say is. And then at the end of that 10, 20 people, you would have a much better understanding of what's being said. Don't feel that it's wrong to be like this, to talk like this, to communicate like this. It isn't, because we all do it. But understand, bring awareness to it, help other people understand us, is not just about the other person understanding what we're saying. It's about us helping them to understand. It's a two-way street, as most things are, to be fair. So when we're looking at painting pictures and losing content, how our conversations are happening, then bringing some focus back to it is helpful and means that both people will feel more connected, as I've said, and more being heard and listened to. Don't allow it. Challenge it, but in a respectful way. Not as a criticism, but just as an exploration. I'm wondering if what I heard was true. Was this what you were saying to me? No, it wasn't. Oh, right, okay, can we go back over it? And then you'll find over a period of time, you'll lose that insecurity, that vulnerability, and you will become more able to engage with less pictures and more content. It's a process. It's not wrong or right, it's just a process. But it's a process that doesn't help sometimes. If you'd like this podcast, if you've enjoyed what I've said, please like and share. Please send it on to other people, as I've said, and as I do say. You never know where anybody else is in this world. They usually don't tell you exactly how they're feeling, what's going on for them, because of vulnerabilities and insecurities. but it might help them to understand things a lot more and to rearrange their communication, their process, in order to feel more heard and listened to. We can then get the problem sorted out much quicker. We can bring resolution much quicker. Two parties can work together in order to make that happen. And that will give you better connections, better relationships in all sorts of ways. So don't allow it, challenge it in a respectful way, as I've said. And hopefully then we'll start looking at better communication processes and feeling listened to and heard. My name's Ian Wallace. I'm the Messed Up Counsellor. Take care. Enjoy.